Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming along to my talk. It's the second time that I've presented here at NDC Sydney, so great to be back at the conference and back in this city as well, because I live over in Perth, which is definitely part of Australia. One of the conversations I was hearing yesterday is we were seceding, but at least for now, we're still in it. So my name is Anton. I'm one of the dev team leads at the company Doist. So we make Todoist, the to-do list application, and Twist, which is a kind of messaging application. Doist is quite an interesting company. It's sort of async first, so everyone is spread all around the world, and it's kind of an interesting place to just sort of grow and work in like that. But for me personally, I've been in sort of front end for quite a while when IE6 was still considered the standard that we would build for. And I'm a bit of a donut fan, as my shirt and kind of slides are going to demonstrate throughout this talk. So all my demos and graphics are very donut themed, so we're going to take that journey. And of course, because I'm not here from Sydney, if you know any places here in the CBD, do come and find me later and let me know about them. But CSS is what we're actually here to talk about. It's an exciting time to sort of be part of everything that's happening in CSS. It's so fast now that we're able to start using these things, right? Like in the IE6 days, you'd hear about something and it'd be years before you can kind of reliably use it, whereas that's down to sort of months in some occasions. And there's some great stuff that's going to make our development life that much easier, and it's going to benefit the end users by removing JavaScript, which decreases the bundle size, makes everything a little bit quicker, and we get those new features. So it is pretty win-win for everyone. Now, there is quite a lot coming to sort of modern CSS, and we're going to look at the sort of items that I would consider ready to use in a bit of detail, and then we're just going to look at the edge of what is there. But this is a big list, so do not worry. After this talk, you're gonna sort of feel ready for CSS in 2024 and a little bit beyond that. If you're interested in sort of keeping up with everything CSS, I've always found the W3C working group a good way to do that. Now, this is intended for the implementers of CSS, so those working in the browsers, but it's nice just to keep an eye on it. And I've also found it a good resource just to refer back to when I need a little bit more detail. Like I answered a question I had about container queries the other day by diving into this. So on the title slides, I'm going to list the module that this refers to if you want to go have a look at it. But it is quite dense as well. As an alternative, the web.dev sort of new to the web articles are a monthly rundown of, not just CSS, HTML, JavaScript, everything that's coming along to the web in that time. So another good one is there. But first up, we are going to look at the cascade and responsiveness. And if you've used tools like Sass, Less, CSS modules, you have likely come across nesting, even if you haven't used it sort of day to day. And it's so prevalent in these tools that we are getting it just natively as part of the language. And the good news is it's supported across all of those evergreen browsers. So depending on your browser support, this could be a step in your tooling that you just no longer need anymore. You could take it out if that's possible, simplifying your build process. So let's look at our donut card that we have for our fictional store with nesting added. The syntax will look familiar to you if you've used nesting, and there's a reason for that. The community kind of voted on what they wanted it to look like, so naturally it went towards the tools that we were used to. The main selector is there with any of the styling that you want for your card. And then for the header, we can say, here's the thing, and that's only going to affect H2s that are within the card element. It saves us repeating the card selector and should make refactoring easier down the track. And like the pre and post processes, we aren't limited to nesting being the first item in there. So if we have a dark theme, we can then use the ampersand signal selector character, to then say that we want the card to sort of be the next thing in there. And actually, like just before coming into this talk, saw Lee Veru tweet about how you can even do almost if-else style things by using the not selector. I didn't have time to add it, but I thought, hey, check out her tweet if you want to have a look at some other options there. But also your media queries and container queries can go in there. So it's really great for co-locating your styles together and managing things, particularly in this, component first way that we are working on things. Now this is relevant. It was more relevant, but it's now sort of relevant if you're Safari 17.2 and below and Chrome 120 and below. The parsers didn't know if you started with an alphanumeric character whether you were saying, oh, this is a new rule or this is a new property that you were defining. So you had to start with the ampersand signal to give the browser a clue, hey, I'm nesting here. They've since figured that out, and so it's no longer a concern. If in doubt, you can chuck the ampersand signal. Wow, I can't use the word character today. That thing, chuck it in there and you'll be safe, right? And if you found yourself wondering when you were looking at this, how many levels can I nest something? It is 128. And if you hit this limit, maybe reconsider where it is you're going with this, because that means you can nest 128 rules down. You shouldn't hit this, but if you do, maybe have a little think, I might change my approach. So yeah, that CSS nesting might be very familiar to you, might be new to you, but it's an interesting sort of situation that these things that are in these processes are just becoming part of CSS natively. So the cascade is important to CSS. It is the C in CSS after all. And it's also one of those things that can be really difficult. It trips folks up all the time. And I sort of understand why that is. It can be difficult to handle. And that's where tooling like BEM, Cube, ITCSS, and to a degree Tailwind have come to be, because it helps developers tame or often just sidestep the cascade entirely. So to sort of help sort of make it more manageable, we're going to be introduced to Cascade Layers. Browser support is pretty good, but there is a little bit of an asterisk on this one. We'll cover that in a second. But now, typically when you're working with CSS, if you're using a framework or something like that, you're going to be importing your CSS, and the order can be a little bit magical. We might get the reset styles, custom properties, some vendor stuff. That's always fun. The themes, and it all just sort of ends up in there together. Manage the sort of specificity and things cascade as best you can. What Cascade Layers are going to allow us to do is define groups for our styles. So limiting the cascade within that layer. So we might put sort of our really early styles in a layer like base and sort of limit them to that. What does that mean in code terms though? So we might have a layer base, theme, components, and utilities. And the order is important here. So utilities is considered the highest and base is the lowest. And to help make sure that we are understanding that order, the best thing to do is define your layers as early as you can in your CSS. So whatever file is coming in first, we want to define those. And if we were to define another base later, I don't know, bring a new component, something happens, that is still going to end up in the order that you're expecting that to be in. So it's a good habit to get into. You can import whole style sheets into there. So if you were using an external framework or something like that, you can bring that into your layer and have it in the base layer low so that you know that you can win out over it later. And we'll kind of dive into that, the specificity and the cascade and how that's affecting it. Somewhere in our CSS, we may have had like UL, LI, first child, and it's red with an underline. It's got a high specificity, 0012. And we've come along and we're like, oh, we actually need it to be our brand purple with no decoration, but the red one is winning. It's got the higher specificity there. If we instead put our layer of vendor and theme, we'll put our vendor styles in there. It's still got the higher specificity. And we can do the vendor and theme, But our theme one is going to win out because it is higher in the layers. So we're now getting a great way of managing all of this without fighting with the styles all the time. So has anyone here worked with ads? Yeah, you'll get it. Very handy for these things. Nesting is an option if that was something you needed. If you have your theme, you can say theme.customprops, theme.spacing. That's just, I think, personal choice if you found that to be useful. And it's a different methodology of working with things. So the browser tools are going to be very helpful here. The CSS layers will be defined there. It's going to show you that reset is low and demo, in this case, is high. And when you inspect that, you'll see which layer this code is coming from. Layer demo has the anchor, layer reset is low down there. So the dev tools are going to be really helpful in understanding this approach. The styles, if you don't put them in a layer, they do become part of a layer. It's an anonymous layer, and that anonymous layer is the highest in there. So if you start using layers and you don't put everything in one, if it's just a regular CSS rule, it is just going to be at the top of everything. And important is going to play a part here. So if I have an important sort of rule on a layer, so let's say vendors have come in and they're like, this is really important, that's going to flip the order of those around. Your anonymous is now your lowest one, and it's going to go down until it finds the highest important. So something that can still sort of catch us out here, unfortunately. And layers aren't scoping. So one of the reasons for these different approaches and tools to CSS is to try and sort of limit the scope of we're doing that. Scope is coming, but I felt it was a little bit too early to add to this talk. But I just wanted to highlight that sort of calling it base and card, that paragraph is still global. It's not limited to a card. We're just defining the order of our layers in there. So a card component isn't only going to select that. That paragraph is winning over everyone. And the big one, the reason why I sort of mentioned the asterisks, now that you might be excited about it. So the good thing about CSS is it's very flexible, it's very forgiving. If a CSS isn't working, it will just often ignore that. And we make use of that in progressive enhancement. We might want to use a new color and we'll put a fallback there. So what do you think will display here? Is it going to be the stuff inside the layers, or is it all going to disappear? It's all going to go. So if the browser doesn't support it, it ignores all of it in the layers. So it's not just going to ignore the layer definitions, everything must go. So it is a handy tool, and it'll be a useful tool, but you will have to make sure that your browser support is where it needs to be. And there's options like a post CSS plugin. And what that will do is process the CSS. It's going to go through and find the layers. It's going to change the specificity of each of those rules, and then strip the layer out. So you're losing some advantages there. It's worth looking at that around media queries and those dynamic elements of CSS. But the option is there if you have a simpler approach to CSS. Yeah, so you may need to wait for this one until you're certain. It's going to be a real quality of life upgrade for those of us who have struggled with Cascade in the past. And I'm hoping it won't be too long until we can all use it. Kind of a little chaser to that one, just touching on it. Media query range syntax. Safari was the latest one to add this, but I still just sort of kept it as a quick slide. And there is a post CSS plugin as well to fill the gap. But previously, media queries would be defined by min width, max width, and it's a little bit like USB. You try it one way and you didn't get what you want, so you flip it around and you try it the other way around. These are using, mathematical expression, and at least in my perspective, I found this to be a much easier way to understand what's happening. Less than, greater than, equal to, etc. And the width keyword, you can, put that in there. There's a great demo on MDM that has each of the pathways that are available there. I personally found it an easier way to do it. And last one here is custom media queries. There is no browser support, but there is a post CSS plugin, and we've actually used this one in our design system. And what I like about it is we can define our custom media, our media queries like custom properties in CSS. So we can lock in those sizes that we want and then use it later like a custom property. meaning that we're not going to accidentally type the wrong number in or make any mistakes there. So really useful for consistency. Okay, so some layout kind of things. Container queries. If there's probably one thing that is the most exciting or the biggest change to CSS, it would be container queries, especially when you're working component first, React, Vue, etc. Media queries were great, right? You know, they brought on responsive design and making it so we would go everywhere. But there's these times where you want your component to react to the size of the parent and not the window. And that is exactly what container queries is going to give us. Support has reached a great milestone across the Evergreen browsers again. And I believe it was Valentine's Day last year, so we're about a year into it, that the last browser added support for container queries. So let's again head to the shop. We have the same card component here used twice. Now what I'm doing here is changing the size of the parent container. So not the window, the parent container. And we can see that our component starts to adjust when it has more size. It changes its layout. It gives itself a bit more space and does things. This allows us to use the same component in different situations. So what does the code look like? Here we have our containment thing. We add container on there and we have a container query. This tells the browser that we're going to be querying this for size information. We can't just query any container. We need to opt into this. And I believe that's to do with performance and things like that. When you add containment to the parent, there's two properties that you can set. There's the container name. This is optional, but useful. And I'll show that in just a second. The other property is the container type. Now, it's always going to be inline size for now. And it's a little bit like grid and subgrid. Subgrid was causing problems, so they decided to get grid out and then bring subgrid along later. So it was similar here. Inline size is what you'll be using this for the majority of the time, but block size is coming, or height, orientation, other properties are coming. But for now, this is the one that is supported. With the containment set to the parent, we can then change our container. So for the card, we know we have more space, so we can change the grid template columns to be a little bit bigger. We change it to 2 columns instead of 1. And our image, we know that has more space now, so we adjust the aspect ratio to be 16:9. So we can now adjust quite easily to changes in layout from the parent. So this will be very powerful in UI development and save a lot of effort in not creating sort of the same component but needing different styles. So you might need to pass a property or something like that. You can just handle all of that in the CSS. And earlier I was talking about that optional property. So we'll have a look at why that's important and some of the power that comes with it. If we have 2 containers, so we have our card footer and we have our container around it, we've given both of them a name. And so what that allows us to do is say the container with the card footer. So we're specifically asking for card footer in this one, but we could also ask for card container if we wanted to. And now, as our footer adjusts, we can change the button inside to have a little more text or show the SVG that's there. And so if the footer was to be in another column, it's useful because it can still shrink to the size that's available to it, to where it's sitting. It's very dynamic. So it's best to kind of get into the habit of giving your container a name along with that container type. And again, debugging and browser tools, like it's a big shift in how we're doing things. So if this is Chrome, it will mark it as a container. And then when we select the child of that and hover over it, it'll show the inline size, because it's not the window that's deciding any of this for us now. It's actually the parent. So the responsive design tools are going to be a little less useful in these scenarios. And one of the things I quite like is container query units. So what we're doing here with button inline size 80 CQI, which means container query inline size or width. I've gotten into the habit of using those, of course, the name of whatever that is escapes me, but inline size, block size instead of width and height. And I'm saying here, inline size, 80% of whatever the closest container is. So it might be in something and we're going all the way up, say, I want you to be 80% of this. So that can be really great for responsive CSS as well. Now, the support's good. We're about a year into it, but there is a polyfill for this. It's in maintenance mode, and I'd sort of advise only using it for where you really need it, right? It's adding JavaScript, it's adding the weight of that, there's all that processing of it. But the option's there if you should need it. So yeah, if there's one technique I think taking away from this talk that is really going to change how you do CSS, container queries is going to be that one. Subgrid. So I've talked about Subgrid for a while now, and then I have to disappoint everyone when I show the browser support. But not anymore. Chrome has joined us in the Subgrid party as of version 117, meaning it's now across all of the browsers. So I can sort of finally show you all the different awesome things we can do with this and actually go away and use it. So let's hope I haven't oversold it. A typical kind of use case is when something like these cards. So when you create a grid, it's only the direct children of that grid that have access to it. But often it's necessary to nest a layout. So if we have cards like this, we have that wrapper around it. And in doing that, all the children now don't know anything about the grid parent. And when you get the design for these, everything's always lining up really nicely. Like it looks great. The space is all evenly, everyone's having a good time. And then you go to development and you've got things like responsiveness to take care of, internationalization. So we translate to about 19 languages to do it. So you can imagine how some of those sort of like Germany, when they come in, they're just like, here goes your layout. And so we can see that when they're in there, the lines and everything are defined. They just don't know anything about it. And this is where Subgrid comes in. So it's a property of either grid template columns or grid template rows. That's it. It's not a new style of grid. We don't have to do anything like that. We just define the property and it's going to pull them down into that. And we're only asking for the rows here. So you can pick and choose as you need. Now, whenever the body content grows, so here we'll have our thing, and when we hit that, the parent grows and all the children are inheriting that grid, so they can grow to handle it as well. When the title grew, everything lined up, and that's, the dream, really, for these sort of card things. You inherit sort of everything from that except for line numbers. So when you define named areas in a grid, so we have container start and we define that, and container end, we pull that down into main with subgrid, and then our card, which is inside of main, says grid column container. So we can even refer to the named areas within our grid as well. There are, of course, limitations, right? When we inherit from the parent grid, we no longer have access to the implicit grid, or how grid decides to add things when the grid gets too big. Often it will add automatic rows or columns, depending on the situation. However many rows or columns you inherit, that's what you've got. So if you need to change anything, you might need to put another grid on top of that or change the layout. And you're also sort of tightly coupling your components with the layout. So you've got to decide whether it's worth it for you in this scenario, because you might have to move everything together rather than just using the components. So Subgrid is going to solve those frustrating alignment issues that we have, and you'll get the most benefit of it in these kind of situations. There's heaps that it can do, but this is sort of one of those good examples. Now, we just talked before about container queries. Along with that is container style queries. And this is going to let us ask the component, tell me if your style is this way. Now, similar to what I was mentioning with Subgrid, how they just brought part of it through, or container queries, they just did inline size. Similarly here, you can only do it so far with custom properties, but that's really powerful. It's a bit like having a Boolean value. So if we have our promo value at 0, if I change it to 1, we can say container style, the promo value is 1, and we can change the entire style, potentially taking the need for its React state into your CSS and you can define the styles there instead. And in the future, you'll be able to say, is the background color this? And then you'll adjust it. Or my sort of favorite example is the sticky headers in the navigation. Often when you scroll, you want the drop shadow to appear on there. You'll be able to say, are you sticky? Yes. I swear I've read that in one of my daughter's books. Are you sticky? Yes. Weird tangent. That just came a... what was I talking about? Masonry layout. This is an interesting one, and I'll tell you why I like it. So Safari Tech Preview is just added it, and it's been behind a flag in Firefox for quite some time. And it's Pinterest, it's the Pinterest layout, right? Like it's that sort of thing, which is why I find it so interesting that it's been added to the spec, because it's so specific. But why I like it, grid, template, rows, masonry, and then an entire JavaScript library disappears from your bundle and from your user thing. And with Safari joining in, I don't know, we might see it in other things. But yeah, I find it one of those great one-line CSS examples. Okay, so that's how we can kind of lay out some things. Let's look at how we can select things in different ways in CSS now. The has selector, I think besides container queries, this is going to be the one that is like maybe second in the most exciting, depending on what you're going to be doing. And again, looking good on the browser support. The has selector has been called the parent selector. Maybe a more accurate name would be relationship selector, because it can do more than just select the parent. But it's the parent part that's really driving the hype for this one. The has selector will allow you to select, let's say, the parent element based on things within inside of it. And I'm sure there have been lots of times where you're like, oh, I wish I could just select this element with this thing inside of it. And everyone's, you know, you'll see it when you search in Stack Overflow and everything like that. It's never been possible. But now we can. So we're going to look again at our donut card. And if the card has an image inside of it, well, we want to adjust that a little bit. So a really sort of straightforward example, if the card has an image, so in CSS, it was always the last thing in the selector that would be styled. So typically it would be image, right? That's not the case here. We're saying the card is our selector, and just let me know if it has an image inside, but we're returning to card to style. And here we're just sort of increasing the border width to show that that's possible. But there's more we can do. So if the card has an image, then I want to style the card header to have a different grid. So we're going to put these on top of each other. And if the card has an image, then the H2, I want to add that yellow background and make it pop a little bit more. The inverse is then also true. If the card does not have an image, then for the H2, without the image, we want to pump that up a bit, right? We don't want it to get lost with the other things. So we can do the inverse of that as well. So yeah, card has something, but what we can't do is nest them. So we can't say that card that has a button that has an SVG and expect that to be selecting the card. That's not going to work, and it's unfortunate, but you probably won't need it because you can chain the selectors. So we can say a card that has an image that has card body and then style a paragraph within that. So one that I found interesting is quantity queries. So if we have a grid, even numbers, cool, looks good. When we don't have even numbers, there's always that like annoying little hole in the grid, and it can look unbalanced, or maybe doesn't match the design, or maybe we want to adjust it. So what we can say is the main has, it's getting weird now, nth, last child, 5, first child, card. We're sort of just saying, how many cards do you have in there? Is it 5? And then we'll change the grid template columns to have 4 columns. And then we're going to say the main has 5, and we're going to select the first card in that. And we're going to make it big and bold to fill up that space. So imagine a news website or something like that, where depending on the number of cards we have in there, we can just dynamically change the layout. Again, don't need to check it in JavaScript and pass properties and classes through. We can just say, hey, check here, we'll handle the styling, you handle the logic. If a form element has an invalid thing inside of it, we might want to style the form. So red border, other things, keeping in mind accessibility, of course. If a button is pressed, so another kind of state thing, if we had a dark theme, we can say if this one's checked, we'll change all the custom properties in our brand to there. If the light one is checked, which would probably be the default, but just for argument's sake, we'll set all those custom properties. So again, we're not needing to keep all of that in state. We'll move it out to a selector. And you can even build Apple's Finder. So you can sort of select the ones on either side of the one that's hovered and change the size of those. So they're all kind of going up in a little thing as well. I'll link off to the examples later. I don't want to sit here and read these funky CSS. There are examples, I will link to them. But basically is a super powerful selector. When we have it with container queries, there's going to be real game changers for sort of intrinsic sizing of components. Let the component manage the space that it has available to it. It's definitely one of the biggest changes in how we think about working with CSS. So I'm really excited to see what this does. And sort of another exciting thing to do is animate stuff. So if we're selecting, we're sizing, how can we really make it move and interesting? Now, view transitions has just sort of made it to the candidate recommendation, but I still think it's interesting enough that we're going to dive into it a bit. But it's Chrome. In the Chrome world of browsers from about 111 onwards, Firefox said that they're working on their implementation, and Safari has expressed interest. So cool. I'm interested in their interests in that. But I think once you see it, you'll be excited and you'll express interest in kind of what it can do. So the view transition APIs, I've got to call mum. So we'll do native app-like transitions. This is to do a mobile application. And of course, we can do similar things on the web, but we might have had to have the entire DOM in there at the time, which can cause sort of problems if our DOM gets too busy. Or we can, it's possible, but it's complicated. So the view transitions is going to make that a little bit easier. So the version that we're going to talk about here is for single-page applications only. There is work being done on multi-page application. There's an explainer here. But I felt that was too early to be going into. I'm sort of going on what's released in Chrome now. And when something's in Chrome, there's avenues like Electron and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to focus on, SPA only for today. Back to our donut store. So it's an SPA with a list of donuts, and we can check and click on the donuts for more information that we want to do. And we'll see a little crossfade to that. The default sort of animation, it wasn't star wipe, it was crossfade. So we can see document.start view transition, and then we do the DOM stuff in there. Now it depends, there's examples out there for React, Vue, etc. Each of them has to do this a little bit differently, but the main idea of it, start the view transition, have a callback, do your things in there. Now what that does is add a bunch of pseudo elements to the page. So there is the view transition, there's the view transition group, and there's an image pair of old and new. It's effectively taking a screenshot of what was there and what's coming in next. Visually, what that looks like, there was our page before in that pseudo element, and then there's the page where we're going in that pseudo element. And then we can just adjust it with CSS animations. So the world of CSS animations is now open to you. We could adjust the duration if we wanted to both of those things. And similar to other things we've talked about with the container queries, how we can give it a name and an ID, this is becoming sort of a common pattern in CSS. We can select our breadcrumb area and say the view transition name is breadcrumb. And now what we have is a whole new group of those. So we don't just have to do the page, we can start to get granular with this. If we were to look at that in there, so when I navigate up here where the home icon is, our product thing slides in, and that was on new. You'll see it fades out on the old because we can just target the new one in those pseudo elements, and we can give it that animation of slide in from the right. And then if you wanted a different one for old, like it exploding, then you can do that. The dev tools are again going to help us out here because it's CSS transitions. We can have the tools open, do the transition, and then debug in there. You don't just have to set the duration to a really long time. Like it's like the console log of testing in this stuff. So what I've done now is gone through and just added names to a bunch of the elements. And as we navigate through, we'll see that the image sort of brings in, the text slides up, breadcrumb happen when I go out, the image fades out, and all of our donuts slide back in. All just, they're separate pages. It's not all sitting in the DOM. It's all happening with React. The GitHub will have that information. Very powerful stuff. Because of how this works, it's not something that can really be polyfilled. You have the before screenshot, the after screenshot. Instead, embrace progressive enhancement on this one. Check if it's there and then start to do that. And in a lot of cases, I think that will be fine because your app is probably already just transitioning to the next screen. So if you add a bit of CSS in a conditional that does this, then it'll probably be okay. So yeah, it's an exciting addition to CSS. If the MPA version is released, it could really change the sort of area of dynamic sites. Maybe there's less need for SPAs. Safari is adding better support for PWA. I understand there's the EU thing happening at the moment. And Badge API is 16.4. Wonder what that could mean for native versus PWA applications. Or maybe at the moment, this is just going to be a Chrome thing that we kind of use in Electron for now. I don't know. But I'm sure it's one that I'm going to keep an eye on and see how it progresses. Sticking with this, so scroll-driven animations, it's another one where I think it's just replacing JavaScript libraries. Not much on this yet. Animation timeline, scroll block, so height, and the root element. So if we wanted one of those progress animations that are quite popular, we can just do it with CSS and link it to the scroll of another element. A little bit early, one to keep an eye on. Colors. And I've used the Australian spelling for when I'm talking about it, and then the American spelling for when we have to do the things. There's a lot of specs, colors complex. There's 4, 5, 6. You can do entire talks on it. People have, NDC London, Haley did a really good one, really diving into color. What I'm going to do is break down on what I think is useful now. The first is the color spaces. So CSS is growing by this many color spaces. For most of the time, color on the web has been sRGB. So RGB, hex colors, HSL, all sRGB, and even things like display P3 are still sRGB. But the problem with that is there's not enough colors for our cool phones now and our laptop screens and everything like that. So the web needed to bring in more colors. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Adam Argyle is going to do a much better job and really dive deep into it in this article if you're interested in finding out. Of those ones that I've highlighted, the most likely that are going to be relevant are LCH, OKLCH, Lab, and OKLab. Particularly, I think LCH will eventually replace sRGB as the default color space in browsers. And so when we're going to be using something like that, we'll have color, we'll call the LCH function, and then lightness, chroma, and hue values will go in there. And then color now for the sRGB ones, display P3, and you'll define them that way. Now, apart from having all these new colors, you'll see a bit of a change in how gradients react. So here we have a gradient defined in the sRGB color space. Particular note the kind of middle there. Here's the same gradient. All we've added is in the LCH color space. And it's very different. Like, it's quite a dynamic thing. And I'm glad that the projector is helping me out here by showing it. It's a much richer color. And the way that colors move between steps will be different, and it can be more dynamic. Now, I'm really simplifying this down, but when it goes between the interpolation between the two colors, it goes the straightest path possible. And then we can start to adjust that now with CSS as well. So if we want to go the long way around, we can add in HSL, or HSL is the color space. You don't need the HSL part, sorry. And we can say longer. So take the long way around. Very colorful sort of thing. Less colors to add into your definition of a gradient as well. Or we can take the still longer but shorter version than the default, and we'll go that way. And, cool. Create some different things, have some different gradients, not have that gray tint in the middle that sort of can happen with gradients. Again, I'm going to refer back to Adam Argyle. his gradient.style site is a good resource for some of those things. Now with each of these, you're going to have to check browser support, but for the most part, modern browsers are going to do this. But you have a couple of options. Progressive enhancement, as I sort of referred to earlier, define a fallback color, and then you can have your LCH one. If that fails, at least you've got something there to back it up. Excuse me. And it's like not even the least interesting slide to pause on. If you need to like really want to check and say define different custom properties based on that, then you also have @supports with LCH or lab, sorry, in this case. Oh, I've done that wrong. That should say lab, forgive me. But yeah, it's a huge area, color theory and all of these things. That's what I think in terms of colors that are going to be useful for you now. Another sort of interesting addition, and I was chatting with someone yesterday about sort of, are we still going to need SAS, less, etc.? Color mix is one of those ones that like you would always use in those libraries. It mixes between two colors, and that functionality is coming to the browsers, and it's already looking pretty good. Of course, check can I use for exactly where that is, but you know, it's looking good. And so what that does is your color mix, we're going to say in sRGB, so you can do any of your color spaces there. We'll have the first color and the second color, and it mixes them together. So yeah, if you're no longer needing that in SAS, you can just move all of it to there. And there's, of course, more we can do. So by default, it's going to mix those colors in a 50-50 ratio. But we can add a percentage value to that. And if I slide more towards color A, in this case, it's saying less of color A. And if I go the other way, I'm getting less of color B. Now, I don't know why you would say do 100% and 0 of 1. It kind of defeats the purpose. But hey, I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. But you can sort of do those things. Now, if you don't add up to 100% in there, what you're going to get is 20% of the first color, 20% of the second color, and the rest will be transparent. So it can be a handy way of generating custom styles and, custom colors. And so the use cases of the pre-processors are pretty kind of well known, but what's the advantage of us bringing this into CSS? Well, the pre-processors, you're locked into it when it is processing the CSS. So if we have user-defined colors, like we have a lot of color themes in Todoist, maybe we could start to make it so users can define their own. And then we can add a tint of, say, button tint of 25% to whatever that color is. So now we're stepping outside of needing to pre-process, and we can be much more dynamic with our colors. So with the addition of that, maybe one less reason for a build step, and we can move more of that functionality to the browser, and hopefully the browser support is kind of where you need it for that one. But I don't think it'll be too long either. Relative color syntax, not quite there with the browser support, but a super interesting one. We can say HSL from the hex value, and then we get each of the color channels, the H, the S, and the L. They're essentially like variables in this scenario. Now, the powerful part is we can now modify those values. So this would be the only way of turning a hex value to have transparency. But we could also start to modify the hue or the lightness and generate an entire color theme just by having one base color. And again, if we have user-defined colors, we might be able to just generate an entire theme just from having relative color syntax. So quite exciting. Now, of course, if we're doing all these dynamic color things in the browser, sorry, it's only Safari and it's behind the flag, but contrast is going to be important. So if we have our base color here and we select that, color A and color B, CSS is going to say, okay, which one of these mathematically has the best contrast? And so as we change each of these, CSS is going to decide, based on that base color, which one is the most appropriate to show here. So again, if we're getting dynamic, we need to have ways of supporting our users. Really hoping to see the other browsers join in at that bottom corner soon. And more, I couldn't think of categories for these ones, so we just get and more. Has anybody wanted to do trigonometry in CSS? well, good news for the no one that raised their hand. No, there is a lot of power. I was joking with this one because I've kind of forgotten that. I haven't had to use it for a long time, but CSS has had really decent math capabilities since the introduction of calc with min, max, and clamp functionality. And that ability is going to get a little bit of a boost with trig functions. What are we going to have? Sin, cos, tan, and the inverse versions of those, arc, asyn, acos, and atan too. You pass sort of the angle into the sin, cos, tan, you'll get between -1 and 1, or negative infinity and infinity in tan's case to get the angle back. And in the inverse version, you give you put the degrees in, you get the number back. In the arc inverse versions, you put the number in, you get the degrees back. So yeah, you put numbers in, you get values out. Why is that important? So if we have our donut menu here, we can do some interesting things with layout. So we can, make it animate out. Oh, sorry, the animation isn't part of that, but the actual layout is what's happening with those trig functions. So we're saying translate them, and we give a calc of the cos in one direction and the sin in the other. Better looking at the demo for that one, but some really interesting areas. You'll be able to sort of play around with animations, dynamic animations in there, placing objects like we saw. And I'm sure there'll be many use cases and demos that come about as we sort of see that browser support grow and people who are a bit more familiar with Trig kind of come along and come up with some nice things for us to see. We're really in experimental territory here. We're in Chrome Canary, but I still think it's an interesting one again because it's replacing JavaScript with CSS. Anchoring will allow you to lock an element to another element. So a tooltip is a really good example. Now, this one is really early. There's not much on MDM, and you're kind of going off what other people have done. So I'm not going to dive too much into this, but there's kind of a try-catch thing. You don't need to do that. You can just say left, anchor, and auto to sort of lock an element to there. So let's look at what that means. So here we've locked the tooltip to there. Now with the position fallback in my try-catch, when it's off the page, it can appear still in a way that's visible to the user. So we're saying try this. If that doesn't work, well then try this one. All of this could change. That's why I'm not going to dive into it too much. But again, exciting to see how they're coming up with things. No JavaScript required. Lock these together. You can link multiple elements together. Again, the GitHub that I'm going to show you in just a second has other examples of that. Whew. All right, so there we have it. So many new and exciting CSS features that are coming along that you can either use now or just a little bit in the future. When you're working with components, consider container queries. Now, the has selector and nesting are going to make life great. Subgrid for when you're working with layouts is going to just take away that pain of trying to align everything. Color is getting, well, more colorful and dynamic in there with each of the new color things. We can make our app seem more native with view transitions. And there's all those little nice developer experience things that are coming along with Cascade Layers, custom media queries, and the new range syntax that, of course, the end user doesn't see, but it still makes our life a little bit easier. And I think endears people a little bit more to CSS when it's just made a bit nicer to use. So it's an exciting time to be working with CSS. Now, here's the GitHub. So they're further going to remove the need for pre and post processes. We've kind of haven't used less anymore, which is what we were using. Instead, we're kind of with CSS modules and just using these as we go. I think the really important area is removing the large JavaScript libraries for those areas like scrolling animations and even container queries. Each of the demos on here, because I sort of had limited time but wanted to have a large scope, I've made like anchor multiple, position fallback, anchor size, and different ones. And there's multiple demos of each of the things that I've shown here today often. So you can have a look at those and kind of dig into them a little bit more. Cool, all the cameras are down. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be around. My shirt is very subtle, but try and find me. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you like. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of the conference, but we do actually have time, about 10 minutes for questions by my count, if there are any. No, dazzled you. No problems. Okay, feel free to come and chat with me. Always like chatting about CSS and things. I was a little bit faster today. I was in a sprint, not a marathon. Thanks very much.